I'm Rob Preston. Welcome to another roadmap. William Lowe, my friend William Lowe, a fellow stroke survivor, and I do these as regularly as we can. And recently we were asked to put together a stroke recovery toolkit, the top 10 things you need to know early on in your recovery. We did one last week, and um, this is going to be the next installment in that series, and we'll continue to do them until we cover all of them. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about advocating for yourself and how to become your own best patient advocate, take responsibility for your recovery, things like that. I know, William, before we started recording, we talked a little bit, and you had some thoughts on this that came to you early in your recovery. So why don't you start us off with that?
Yeah, sure thing, Ralph. So when I first had my stroke, which was going back 11 years coming up this October, one of the things which I was told really frequently by my physical therapist was that it was not my fault that I had the stroke. And they kept telling me that, don't worry, you're young, you'll naturally recover. Um, but at the time when I heard this, I knew that this hearing this information, it probably wasn't going to be beneficial to my recovery. And the reason why I say this is because it didn't do anything in terms of helping me to move the needle in terms of making more progress and seeing more changes in my recovery after stroke. And what I found was a lot more beneficial for me at the time was this idea of taking responsibility for my recovery. And the reason why I say taking responsibility is because, especially I had my stroke when I was quite young, 17 years old. It gave me a sense of ownership over my recovery and a sense of control that it was as if it was a wrong which I had to make right in order to move on with my life. And I think that that's really important in recovery after stroke, because if you're not able to take control in your recovery after stroke, then it's a lot harder to actually take that first step to make changes happen and to be able to see more progress in your recovery. And what this means is that you'll just be playing victim to your stroke rather than taking control of what has happened and thinking about the things which you can do in order to, I guess, come back from having had a stroke, or I guess how to overcome a stroke. So I found that this was really beneficial in my recovery, and it also translated to me being able to, I guess, make the most out of my time when I was receiving therapy through the healthcare system. And basically what this involved was kind of accepting that I didn't know everything when it came to my recovery after stroke, and I had to find some way to understand how recovery after stroke happens so that I can make it happen for myself when I was discharged from hospital. So what this led to me doing was asking all the right questions when I had time with therapists, really using them as a source of information so that I could understand the why behind why I had to do certain exercises and why these exercises resulted in the success which I had, so that when I was discharged or when I ran out of insurance, I could replicate this success and I could keep seeing changes and keep making improvements in my recovery, no matter how far I was down the line in my recovery after stroke, whether this be 1 year, 2 years, or maybe even 3 years. So that's basically a mindset which I adopted early on in my recovery, and it's one I highly encourage a lot of stroke survivors to really think about, because obviously you have that added benefit of, I guess, really advocating for yourself and making the most of, the people in your environment to help you get the best quality of life in your recovery after stroke. So I'm just wondering, Ralph, you and we had a discussion about this earlier on. I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts on, I guess, taking responsibility and really advocating for yourself as a stroke survivor in the healthcare system.
Well, I verbalized some of it early on. Some of my thinking on this has evolved over the years as I've interacted and coached people, and also run the Facebook groups and read thousands of posts and see what people are dealing with and how they deal with it. I decided early on in the rehab hospital, specifically remember it, saying to myself, maybe out loud even, that I wasn't going to play the blame game. If anything, my stroke was caused by somewhat by my own negligence, but it didn't seem to make sense to blame anybody or anything. There were some healthcare providers and professionals involved in the whole thing too, but they were trying to help me, and I just decided it was a slippery slope if you tried to play the blame game, and the last thing you wanted to do was blame God or try and figure out something that you basically can't figure out. So in that sense, I was blessed in that I put that behind me right away. I hadn't verbalized a lot of these things, like taking responsibility for your recovery, but I did it right away. I did it in the rehab hospital. I found out they were having pool therapy, and I wasn't hadn't been invited yet, so I made sure I got invited, and I got into more classes around there for a couple reasons, because that was my lifeline to information, and also if you weren't in therapy, you had to sit in a darn room and stare at the television or read a book or do something, and it was help pass the time in a positive way. Since then, I learned some things through my own experience, and I've learned a bunch more helping other people and running the Facebook groups, and that is I don't think you head down the road to recovery much until you clear this issue, until you kind of take care of this and realize that, I say all the time, cavalry's not coming. That's one of them. Nobody's going to do it for you. That's another one. Another one is the answer is inside you. It's not in a device, it's not in a therapist, it's not in circumstances. You have the answer, because the answer is taking responsibility and then acting based on that and making the things happen for yourself in your life that are beneficial to your recovery, rather than, I feel like a lot of people, until they clear this hurdle, they're kind of bouncing around like pinball, and they're getting whacked by bunches of flippers. I just made this analogy up, but the healthcare system and everything's like a set of bumpers and flippers, and you're kind of bouncing around without a lot of direction. So I find that once people take ownership or responsibility, and by that it's very simple. What we mean is that you're responsible to make yourself better. Nobody's going to do it for you. Until you do that, it's easy to play the blame game, the think nothing but about returning to your old life before the stroke, which is impossible. And those things consume a lot of brain power, and you need all that brain power to move forward. We've talked a little bit on this show before about the importance of jumping on things. We did a show on flickers of movement, and we talk about, neuroplasticity lasts forever, but you have more in the beginning. So the longer you take to get through this process, the more neuroplasticity you're burning or not taking advantage of. So I got more thoughts on this, but those are some of my early thoughts about getting over this hurdle. Once you get over the hurdle, there are a number of things you can do for yourself. So maybe you would start us off on that. Well, certainly you're free to comment on the whole attitude and getting over the hurdle thing, but maybe you'd start us off with some of the things that you did or you thought were important or you have found are important for the stroke survivors that you coach and help.
Yeah, sure, definitely 100%. So I mean, I just wanted to reiterate and highlight what Ralph said about, the idea that no one's coming to save you, because it is very much true in recovery after stroke. I mean, with a lot of stroke survivors I've spoken to, um, the majority of them, they've run out of insurance, and it's been a year since they've even had any therapy in their and for most of them, they're still doing the exact same exercise which they got when they actually ran out of insurance and they left therapy, and they're wondering why nothing has changed in their recovery after stroke. Why why the improvement has suddenly reached a plateau, or they're just not seeing improvements as much as they used to. So I definitely think that um, under this umbrella term of taking responsibility, or I guess being an advocate for yourself, there are a lot of things which fall under this, um, to make this such an important thing in recovery after stroke, because what this entails is basically building an environment around yourself which is going to be conducive to your success in recovery after stroke. So what this means is, I mean, for me, I I was very selective with the therapists and the doctors who I surrounded myself with early on in my recovery, because I wanted to learn from therapists who could explain things in a way in which I was able to understand, so that when I left therapy or when I was discharged, I could translate these terms in a language I was able to understand by myself, and sort of become my own therapist, which I know Ralph yourself is something which you did, um, but obviously explained in a different language. Um, but this is something which I found was really powerful. And the way I did this was I actually took a lot of video and I took a lot of film in the early days of my recovery. And I would use this film and I would bring it back to the therapist and sort of turn every single session into a collaboration where I would ask them questions and we would have a back and forth discussion, as if it was almost like two therapists who are helping the exact same patient recover as much as possible. And in a sense, by having this collaboration and having this back and forth conversation with the therapists who were seeing me, or with the doctors who were seeing me, I was able to inform myself and become a really, I was able to really advocate for myself, and reinforce to myself that recovery is possible if I understood how to make it happen, and if I applied what the therapist had told me and I came back to them and I got that feedback. If I kept doing this over and over again, then once I was discharged, I would be able to use the lessons which they taught me to help me continue to see more improvements in my recovery after stroke, and also help a lot of other stroke survivors along the way as well, which I now do as a living as well. So that's basically one of the most powerful things which I would suggest, for those survivors who are watching this. Really consider when it comes to your recovery after stroke. If you have, I mean, just to repeat what Ralph said, no one's coming to save you. No one can get you to, no one can get you to recover. There's no magic pill. There's no gadget currently out there which is going to provide you the solution. Um, I think, I think, in a sense, when I mentioned taking responsibility, it was another way of saying work on the things which you can control, and think about how can you make recovery after stroke happen, and what are the resources which you can tap into in order to help you get get to your best recovery possible after stroke. So would this be maybe a doctor who is who specializes specifically in a certain type of aspect of stroke recovery? Would it be getting in touch with a therapist who maybe isn't linked in with the healthcare system, or maybe they just specialize in a specific thing, such as I'm in a therapy. There's a therapy in stroke recovery. It's called constraint-induced movement therapy, which is basically forcing yourself to use your affected hand or your affected limb all of the time. And just have a think: who are the people which I need to get in touch with, and how can I leverage these people, and how can I use them while I still have therapy through insurance in order to inform myself, so that once I get discharged or once I run out of insurance, I can think for myself and I can sort of think like a therapist, and I can really guide my own recovery on my own. So that's basically what I want to add, and I really think that that's really powerful when it comes to recovery after stroke. Um, and I did reference some of the things which you mentioned previously, Ralph. Just wondering if you wanted to add anything additional to any of the things which I mentioned.
Sure. Some of the things I thought maybe I mentioned some of the things that I did, and some things that are I think are a good thing to do to learn how to implement. And that is, when you're in the hospital or rehab hospital, or you have access to a lot of resources that you don't have once they discharge you. So the very first thing you can do would be to try and take advantage of those resources. I spent 3 weeks in the rehab hospital, and one of the very first things I said to, I had two OTs and a main PT and a secondary PT, and I made it clear to all of them that I needed to understand everything. I needed to understand how it was going to help me and how it was going to fit into my recovery. I hadn't verbalized or thought about yet setting up a home recovery program, because I was in the hospital, and not getting home seemed like a long ways off for a long time until it happened. And then I definitely did start thinking about a home program as I sat in my house in a wheelchair without access to all those doctors and therapists, waiting to get into PT and OT outpatient, which takes a few weeks, and took a few weeks in my case, like it does in every case. But I jumped on it like the day after I got home. I didn't get home till 4 or 5 o'clock the afternoon I was released. But the next day I started on it. So, we've said this before. I use this analogy all the time. I look at PTs and OTs like a piano teacher. So just like when I took piano lessons, I would ask, during the week, I would come up with things that I was having trouble with, and I would remember them. I don't typically write things down, but I remember them and take them up with the piano teacher. Well, I do that same thing with my PTs and OTs right from the beginning in the rehab hospital, and once I got into outpatient physical and occupational therapy. So they're a good resource, and you need to take advantage of them as much as possible. Um, I like a PT and OT to go over what you're doing at home, what your homework was last week. We're probably going to do a segment on getting the most out of your PT, because it's a big subject. But the point here is that they're your only resource. So I liked going over the issues that I had and getting new work and everything, rather than just going. I don't like going to physical therapy and getting stuck on the arm bike, or doing things that I consider are therapy. They can be done at home. Maybe I don't have an arm bike, but I have various exercises that I could do. So you might think about that and how you're dealing with your various therapists. Um, I went to a follow-up appointment with my neurologist, and he said he was releasing me. I said, well, what does that mean? He said, well, it means I don't need to see you anymore. And I said, what if I want to see you? And he said, well, make an appointment. And on that, and I did. I saw him a couple more times. I would save kind of the high level and stroke type questions for him. I didn't ask him anything like PT or OT oriented, but I actually went with a list of 17 questions the first time, and I'm sure I went with the second and third times. I had some questions in mind because that's how you get the most out of sitting down with somebody. Another thing I had to do was I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to have another stroke. Mine was due to high blood pressure. Of course, they put me on blood pressure pills and everything, but I had you know, I wanted my primary care physician, as we call him now, my doctor, to go over it with me because I had continued access to him and to make sure that I was doing the right thing in terms of blood pressure, because the last thing you want to think about or worry about is having another stroke. So I tell people, find out the cause of your stroke if you can, big if you can. Do something about it if you can. And if you can do both those things, then you should be able to sit back and relax. So learning the way the system works is really important, and I've gotten a lot better at it, having helped a bunch of local stroke survivors. I think I've helped 16. No, I know I've helped 16 local stroke survivors, and at least 4 or 5 of them had taken doctor's appointments, and almost all of them at some point ask me if I'll go in, either right away or at some point when they get confused and don't know what the doctor said. So I've sat in on a lot of interactions, and so I learned a lot about it that way. Now, it's not something the average stroke survivor can do, but they can take advantage of trying to learn how the healthcare system works and how to interface with it best. For example, if you want your scans at the neurologist, you might want to check with imaging and make sure that they were sent. I do a lot of follow-up on stuff if there are lab tests or imagery scans, that kind of thing, and you want the doctor to look at them, make sure they're there. Don't expect everything to happen for you, because it won't. And if it doesn't, I look at it as kind of half your fault. Yeah, the healthcare system's a little screwy, but if you know that, then maybe you should do the things that you need to do to make sure that the healthcare system doesn't screw you over. That, when you get to your neurologist, he's got the scans. That the blood works back when you talk to your doctor, that kind of thing. So those are some things that I did and I learned, and I try and teach them to other people, because other stroke survivors, because like you, William, there's only one of me, there's only one of you. We can't do it for everybody else. And there is one person that can make you better. And you look at him in the morning, every morning when you get up, you look at him in the mirror, and that's you. So that's why ownership is so important, because your PT can tell you how to do exercises. They can't do them for you. You have to go home and do what they say, or do what you think is best based on what they and other people say, in terms of you forming a plan as to how you're going to approach your recovery. And I had one, I guess, on day one, because I said, well, I need to walk. I got a hand that doesn't work and a shoulder that doesn't work. So I'm going to set up a plan where I walk every other hour and do my arm every third hour and my shoulder every third hour. I don't think I got the math right on that, but you get the idea. I do walk, shoulder, walk, arm, walk, shoulder, walk, arm, all day long. So as primitive as it was, I got moving and I stayed moving, and those are really key things. We've talked about them before, and jumping on it. So here's the thing about about being an advocate for yourself, about setting up a home program. they're not set in stone. This is a learning experience that you're going to go through for essentially the rest of your life, but it really, very much so, the first year or two as you navigate the healthcare system and try and navigate yourself back to where you would like to be, some semblance uh, of a life that you'd like to have. So uh, that being said, they're not set in stone. You can always learn and always tweak. And, I learn something every time I take somebody to the doctor or every time I listen to an expert. I'm, I'll be 15 years out in the spring and I'm still learning. Yeah, maybe I'm involved in more discussions than the average stroke survivor, but the point is that you can adapt your program based on your current needs or realizations that you have as you implement it, experience it, pay attention to it, and tweak it. So that's basically what I learned and what I did and what I'm still doing. I still go to PT when I can, get a doctor's order, and I always learn stuff, and I bring it home and do it and make it a part of my program. And in a lot of cases, I shoot videos of it and share it with other stroke survivors. Uh, I want to do it for myself, but I like going to physical therapists and learning stuff because I know it has applications beyond me, and I'm planning on continuing to do the work that I do, trying to help other stroke survivors with their recovery. Sorry that was so long-winded, but that's how I try to deal with it on a practical basis. You have any more thoughts on this, William?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add one final thought to that, and it just goes on top of that idea of really advocating for yourself, and it's this idea of driving your own recovery. So one of the things which I've seen often with some stroke survivors, which I've talked online, is that they go to their physical therapist and they receive therapy through insurance, and they find that after a couple of sessions or halfway through their 13 session block, which they're assigned through insurance, that they're still doing the exact same exercises which they were doing from the very first session. And one thing I just want to add to this is that as a stroke survivor and as someone who is advocating for yourself, should you choose to go down that route, it's up to you to drive your recovery. So what this means is that if you're going to physical therapy, a question I often like to ask myself is, do I want to be doing the exact same thing as I did last week? Or do I want to learn something new which can help move the needle further in my recovery after stroke? Because at the end of the day, you only get a limited amount of time with your therapist through insurance. For a lot of stroke survivors, based on what I've been told, it's about half an hour. And there's not a lot you can get done in half an hour. So the biggest reason why a lot of stroke survivors reach that point in their recovery where they plateau or they're no longer seeing changes in their recovery after stroke is because they're doing the exact same exercises which they've always done. And quite often the therapist isn't going to be incentivized to change things up or change the exercises which you've been given unless you prompt them to, or unless you ask them for something new. So just one thing I want to add to that is that under this theme of advocating for yourself, one thing I would highly recommend, and one thing I would highly urge those of you who are watching to really consider, is really driving your own recovery and going to physical therapy with the idea of what you actually want to get out of the session. Because if you want to do the exact same thing which you did last week, and you don't want to see more changes in your recovery by potentially trying out something new, or I guess asking your therapist to suggest something new so that your brain gets a new experience of an exercise so that it can create more neuroplasticity, then it's very likely that your therapist is just going to be watching you do an exercise which you've probably done multiple times, so much so that your brain has already gone on autopilot, and you're not likely going to see more improvements from. So I just thought that that was really important, because I think through insurance, I mean, speaking not only from my own experience, but from what other stroke survivors have told me, is that therapists, um, they quite often will just watch a stroke survivor do the exact same exercise weeks and weeks on end, without necessarily modifying the exercise so that that stroke survivor is able to see more improvements in their recovery after stroke. And at the end of the day, it's up to the stroke survivor to, I guess, make the most out of their time to really prompt or probe the therapist to suggest new alternative ways to really see more improvements, especially during that limited time which you have through insurance when you receive that therapy. Because that's the time, as Ralph said, that you have access to the most resources possible before you run out. You only get a certain amount of funded therapy per year through insurance. So if you can make the most out of that time, then once you're discharged, then you can use what you learnt during that time in order to really drive your recovery, and I guess think for yourself and make things happen for yourself in your recovery after stroke, even once you've been discharged from therapy. Because, like Ralph said, at the end of the day, the only one who can make things happen is yourself, and no one is coming to save you. And so that's just my thoughts on, I guess, really advocating for yourself and really taking ownership or taking responsibility, as you will, for your recovery after stroke, and how this can really benefit, I guess, your overall quality of life after you've had your stroke, as you go through your journey to recovery and get to your best potential recovery after stroke.
Well, two quick points, and I'll try not to reiterate exactly what you said, but I like the driving analogy, because if you're not driving, then you're the passenger. And when you're the passenger, a couple things can happen. You might not like the way the person who's driving is driving. I immediately went to like driving down the highway in a car. And the other thing is, you might not like where they're going. So maybe it'd be a good idea to drive your own recovery. And then you mentioned something about planning and letting others plan versus making your own plan, sort of like the driver versus the passenger analogy. So I would, for the fifth or sixth time, reiterate, take responsibility for your recovery, come up with your own plan. Don't let the physical and occupational therapist just watch you exercise. Challenge them. Interact with them. That's the way to drive your recovery rather than have it happen to you. And I would have to end with the more dissatisfied you are with your current situation, the more I would say you need to be driving your own recovery more. Because if you're unhappy with your situation, it's most likely because it's out of your control. You don't feel like you're getting anywhere, and it's frustrating. I've experienced it. I think we all have. So, any other thoughts, William?
No other thoughts to that. I couldn't agree more with what you just said.
All right, well then we'll end this, and we'll be back soon to do the next installment in this Stroke Recovery Top 10 Toolkit. So thank you, William. for your time as always, and everybody for listening, and we will see you soon.
Great. Thanks, Ralph.